great place to visit. Tonight he's going to talk about something that doesn't exist anymore.
Exactly.
Battle of Turtle Gun Inlet and the aftermath. John?
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Like I said, I'm from historic Cold Spring Village. Has everyone here heard of it or been there?
Yep.
Okay, so I don't need to go too much detail about what Cold Spring Village is, but I will do a quick plug that it is the largest open-air living history museum in New Jersey. So we focus on the history of Cape May County primarily in the period of colonial period up through the beginning of the Civil War. That time period, most of our buildings date from either 1691 up to about 1912. We have 27 historic buildings, and my job there is kind of the jack of all trades. I handle the education programs, the summer interpretive staff, the historic preservation grants, manage all that, and just a little bit of everything that comes along. So one of the things we like to highlight is Cape May County's one small incident within the American Revolution. During the time period of the American Revolution, Cape May County was very, very isolated, very, very rural population. The first census in the United States in 1790 put the county population at around 1,500 people. And so at the dawn of the Revolution, most of these back bays and everything here were totally uninhabited. Right? The towns we know now as Wildwood, Stone Harbor, Sea Island, Avalon didn't start coming around until the 1880s. So back at the dawn of the Revolution, most of the population lived on farms and whatnot in the middle of the county here, and they actually used all those back bay islands to graze livestock. They take their cows and whatnot out there in the summertime, let them graze all summer long, and bring it back to the farms when they need to. But for one brief moment, in June of 1776, Cape May played a small role, and a somewhat important role, in the Revolutionary War. It was actually the only Revolutionary War battle fought within Cape May County. And we'll cover about what happened in the battle, what led up to it, who was involved in it, and also a little bit about why Turtle Gun Inlet itself no longer exists. So Turtle Gun Inlet used to be right here, just north, a couple miles north of the entrance to what is now Cape May Harbor. So it was a small inlet that led into the back bays of what is now Wildwood Crest. So, obviously for a group like this, I don't need to go into all the details leading up to the Revolutionary War. But the key things here leading up to the battle here is the fact that after the British evacuated Boston, they moved up to Halifax to regroup, and George Washington moves from Boston to New York City to fortify that, because in his thoughts for that was to be the next place the British were going to attack. So, after the British left Boston, they started a blockade of American ports. Right, it starts in the Prohibitionary Act of March 1st, 1776. By the time the blockade of American ports was in full effect, there were 32 British ships blockading most of the ports. However, at this point in June of 1776, the blockade was not in full effect yet. That wouldn't happen for another couple of years, and we'll get into that. So this sets the stage for the battle. The British are blockading the Delaware Bay. Right? This is the map of New Jersey sideways. So here's Cape May down here. This is Delaware. This is the Delaware Bay, river up to Philadelphia. So the British had set out an order to seize all American shipping going into the port of Philadelphia in the effort to try and prevent supplies from reaching the Continental Army. We'll get into the actual blockade itself, but they had 3 ships operating off the entrance of the Delaware Bay near Cape Henlopen, modern-day Lewis, Delaware. And what was happening is that American privateers, a lot of them doing with the local harbors and pilots, were doing their best to evade that British blockade by coming around the shoals around Cape May and navigating the shoals and shallow waters of the Delaware Bay leading up into the river. These people that knew those waters intimately. And in addition to the privateers running, they actually did attempt some blockage of the Delaware River in order to prevent British ships from going all the way to Philadelphia. So these fortifications, these river defenses, were installed in the Delaware River. There's a map here showing the location of some of these right near where the airport is today. Here's the Schuylkill, there's the Delaware, so that's right near Fort Mifflin. And these were large spikes, 29 feet long, that were embedded in the Delaware River to prevent British ships from going up the river. So that was one way they were helping to fortify and protect Philadelphia. And obviously the local pilots knew their way around where they were. One of these actually came ashore near just south of Philadelphia after Hurricane Sandy. It was still in very good condition. It's like a 29-foot long log with a metal spike attached to it. So you can imagine that it was quite a strong defense you wouldn't want your ship running aground on. Because they were embedded just below the water line, so if your ship came up the river, you know, wreck on that. So the British knew they were there, they didn't know where they were. This map was actually put together by Hessian troops after Philadelphia was taken over later in the war. So, the goal is to get supplies up to Philadelphia, to the Continental Army, to give them all supplies that they would need. That job fell to this person, Robert Morris, okay? Pennsylvania delegate to the Continental Congress. I'm sure many of you are very aware of him. Member of the Committee of Safety, who was in charge, one of the many roles of obtaining gunpowder for the Continental Army. So, one of the things he did was he would charter sea captains and merchants to go down to the Caribbean to get supplies, bring them up to Philadelphia, run the blockade, supply the ship. So what he does, in March of 1st, 1776, he charters a friend of his, a captain named Hugh Montgomery, who had just given command of a brigantine called the Nancy, with orders to go down to the Caribbean, load a bunch of supplies, and bring them back to Philadelphia. So in early June, there's a picture of the Nancy down in St. Thomas. I'll get into the history of this picture here in a little bit. But at this point, St. Thomas and St. Croix are part of the Dutch West Indies. So they were able to sneak into there and acquire supplies. So, in early June, they loaded up. The total cargo was 386 barrels of gunpowder, 55 firelocks, 101 hogsheads of rum. The rum's very important, got to keep the troops happy. And having been to the Caribbean myself in my time at the Coast Guard, good stuff down there. And they also brought up 62 hogsheads of sugar, probably to make more rum. This is a report to the Continental Congress that was given to them after the battle. Now at this point, it's kind of important to pause a little bit and get into some of the myth and the history surrounding the Nancy's trip and things that happened in the battle. Most of what we know about Hugh Montgomery and the Nancy comes from his daughter, Elizabeth Montgomery. No relation to the Witch Star. Different family entirely. But she claims, in later writings, that, if you see the flag they're flying, that she claims that her father was the first ship to fly the Stars and Stripes in a foreign port. According to family legend, they had heard about the Declaration of Independence, and so Hugh Montgomery commissions one of his 17-year-old ensigns to make a flag and fly it up the yardarm during a feast held for the governor of St. Thomas prior to sailing. Now, there are all sorts of problems with this story. It also says that the ship fired a 13-gun salute to the 20 guests that were on board the Nancy. The Nancy is a very small ship. Now, part of the problem, and there's another picture of the Nancy supposedly in St. Croix on that same voyage. The problem is that Nancy never actually knew her father. Okay, Elizabeth Montgomery never knew her father. She recounts this in her memoirs, Reminiscences of Wellington in Familiar Village Tales, Ancient and New. It was written in 1851 when she was in her mid to late 70s. Right? Again, she never knew her father. Hugh Montgomery died when Elizabeth was an infant. So this is all tales and told, family legends told for generation to generation that she eventually writes down 70 years later. There's another account that talks about the young ensign that supposedly made the flag. That tale comes from that ensign's grandson, excuse me. And that tale was written in 1898, which was 50 years after the ensign had died. So there's a lot of myth, a lot of legends and whatnot. But part of the important thing about this story that Elizabeth Montgomery tells in her history is that it was used to help support a claim made by a man named William Canby. Anyone know who William Canby is? William Canby was Betsy Ross's grandson. William Canby in 1870 went to the Philadelphia Historical Society when they were getting ready for the centennial celebration of American independence and they were gathering tales and stories of the Revolution. And he said, my grandmother made the first American flag. That's the first time Betsy Ross's story comes into the national consciousness. Now, what are the problems? Okay, Elizabeth says that, go back, that this is the first time the American flag is flown in a foreign port. Well, this is June of 1776. Independence hasn't been declared yet. Still a few weeks away. There's also, that's not what the American flag would look like in 1776, right? The official stars and stripes and stars doesn't become declared until 1777 on June 14th, which is now Flag Day. Right. So again, this is a lot of myth and legend and folklore that kind of gets told down the years. Now, it's quite possible that they had a flag on board. It was probably the Grand Union flag that had the British Union Jack and the cannon. That may have been placed on board the ship. Right. So, it's a good example of how myth and legend kind of get wrapped up in history, and it's hard to kind of remove the fact from the myths and the legends over time. But back to the actual story. The Nancy set sail in late June, and they know they're going to have to run the blockade. So, William Morris knows that the Nancy is due back sometime late June, early July. So he notifies another one of his friends, man we've all heard of, a man named John Barry, who was in charge of a small squadron of American ships in the Delaware Bay, and his job was basically to harass the British warships and help escort and protect American shipping coming into the bay. John Barry had just been given command of the USS Lexington. So that's the USS Lexington. By way of comparison, right, the Nancy only has a crew of 11 and 6 guns. Okay? That's all she has to defend herself. Which is another thing that having a party on board for 20 guests and the governor is probably not really happening here. Lexington, however, looks impressive. She's a 2-masted brig. She's only 86 feet long, has 14 guns. Okay? Keep that in mind, it's just going to come apart. All right? The rest of the squadron is the USS Wasp and the USS Reprisal. All right? The Reprisal was 100 feet long and had 18 guns. She was captained by a man named Lambert Wicks of the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And the Wasp was 74 feet long and had 14 guns. Now, by these pictures, they look like impressive vessels. But again, keep in mind their size. Those of you who are familiar with Cape May know the Coast Guard has a training center there for recruit training. They have several ships stationed there. That's one of them. That's an 87-foot patrol boat. So that's the size of the ships that the Americans have to protect American shipping going into Philadelphia. And like I said before, the British only have 3 vessels maintaining the blockade. However, they are rather impressive vessels. Right, the first is the HMS Liverpool. And this is a ship of the line. She was 118 feet long, had 28 guns. Right. She's accompanied by the Orpheus and the Kingfisher. The Orpheus is 130 feet long, 32 guns. And the Kingfisher, 97 feet long, 16 guns. Right. So, the Americans are obviously very much outgunned, but because the Nancy and the 3 ships that the Americans have are smaller, they're more maneuverable, so they can get in and out of those little inlets and passages and around the shoals in the Delaware Bay. But, before we get into the battle itself, a little detour. This battle is very much overlooked in American history. Doesn't make very many history books. In fact, there's a long, detailed account of the history of Cape May County, and this battle takes up about 3 paragraphs. There's another book that I have I'll mention here that has a much more detailed account, which is where I get most of the information from. But part of the reason that this is happening is this battle happened on June 29th, June 30th, 1776. A very important thing is happening a little bit north of Cape May, though, at this exact same time. Like I said at the beginning, the British have regrouped to Halifax, gathered their forces, with the anticipating that they're going to attack New York. Well, the same day this is happening down in Cape May, the British arrive in New York Harbor. It is the largest assembly of amphibious force ever assembled in the world at that point in time. All told, by the time all the forces were in place, there were 32,000 soldiers, 10,000 sailors, 330 warships, all had amassed outside New York Harbor, just off Staten Island, where the Verrazano Narrows Bridge is today, getting ready for the eventual invasion of Long Island in New York, where they would end up chasing George Washington, the Army, into New Jersey. So, needless to say, with this happening just north, the little things happening in Cape May are a blip on a radar that doesn't exist, which is why this gets very much overlooked. But it has an important story to tell. So, the battle itself. What ends up happening is in the afternoon of June 28th, the Orpheus spots the Nancy coming up the coast. They signal the Kingfisher, and the two of them get their forces together and begin chase of the Nancy. Around the same time, there's an American lookout in Cape May that sees the Nancy coming up the coast, gets flag signals back and forth, understands what's going on. The lookout in Cape May signals John Barry on the Lexington. So what ends up happening is that evening, Barry, along with the captains of the Wasp and the Reprisal, get together and have a meeting to decide what the strategy is going to be. Now, it was determined that night it was very light winds, not particularly good opportunity for the American ships to be able to come down and physically escort the vessel. The conditions weren't right. So what they're going to do is, instead of escorting the vessel in person, what they're going to do is they're going to launch their longboats. They're going to escort the Nancy into one of the local coves with the longboats. So during the course of that meeting, Lambert Wicks on the Reprisal, his younger brother, Richard Wicks, demands that he's 31 years old, he's a young lieutenant, he wants to prove his mettle, prove his patriotism. He begs his brother, let me lead the Reprisal's longboat to the Nancy, let me be in charge of the expedition from our ship. And Lambert agrees. This is the time for his brother to prove his worth. So the actual battle itself. And I have to give credit here, most of the information that we have about the battle comes from this book here by author Tim McGrath, who did a long detailed history of John Barry's logs and records. So most of the information we have is fairly recent about what the actual aspects of the battle were. So, in the early hours of the 29th, pursued by the British, and which were basically preventing them from being able to enter the bay due to the wet light conditions, Hugh Montgomery decides that he's going to take it to the Nancy into Turtle Gut Inlet. Okay. The plan is to take it into the shallow water, offload the cargo, because the Turtle Gut Inlet was fairly shallow, and the British could not pursue them into the harbor, or into the inlet. So at this point, early that morning, Richard Wicks launches his longboat from the Reprisal, comes aboard the Nancy. Prior to doing this, he had met with John Barry, who said, look, instead of just running it into Turtle Gut Inlet, take it in, run it aground. Get it as close to the shore as humanly possible so you can offload the cargo before the British can get close enough to start firing their guns and launch their longboats and get in. So, Richard Wicks joins the Nancy. He's joined shortly thereafter by John Barry and the longboats from his vessel. So their crews take over the Nancy, they run it aground, and the plan is to basically create a bucket brigade style offloading of all the cargo onto the shore in Cape May County. Now, by about 8:30 or so, the Kingfisher and the Orpheus begin shelling. They're almost in range of the Nancy. They start firing their cannons. Start shelling the Nancy for about a good half hour while they're starting to offload this cargo. This goes on for about an hour. Amazingly, the whole time of this bombardment that's going on for this hour, there's only one minor American casualty who's mildly injured when a cannonball hits one part of the Nancy and the splinters hit him. He's a little bit injured. So for the first hour, this is going pretty well according to plan. All the cargo is being offloaded. Under the hail of cannon fire, it's going fairly well. But however, the Orpheus and the Kingfisher begin to get closer and closer to the point where they're going to be able to launch their longboats with their troops and seize the Nancy. It's at this point John Barry decides he needs an alternate plan. He needs to modify the plan a little bit. So he decides he's going to set a trap. And by 9:30, he had offloaded most of the cargo. Let's see. At this point, only 121 barrels of gunpowder were left on board. So Barry decides, we've got as much as we can off, so he sets a trap. He takes 40 barrels of the gunpowder, puts them in the captain's cabin. He then uses one of the sails, creates a fuse from the barrels down to the rest of the barrels in the cargo hold. He then orders all hands to abandon ship. And then at the very last moment, as the last sailor is about to come off the Nancy, he sees that the American flag is still flying, whether that was the actual American flag or the Grand Union flag, we don't know. He decides to scale the yardarm, pull the flag down, and he's the last person off. The British, seeing the flag come down, see that as a sign of surrender. They'll give a hearty huzzah and launch their longboats to board the Nancy. Right? John Barry and his crew bring some of the cannons ashore from the Nancy in order to continue bombarding, firing back to kind of prevent the British from getting there as soon as they possibly could. And eventually, with the fuse lit and the British coming, the British board the Nancy just as the fuse reaches the hold. And what I kind of describe as the Wile E. Coyote moment, the Nancy explodes. Now, rumor has it, again, there's a lot of rumors in the story, that this explosion, again, this is 121 barrels of gunpowder. The explosion was supposedly heard in Philadelphia. It's a very powerful blast. All right. The British reported the loss of the Kingfisher's master's mate and 6 of the men. The total was probably a bit higher. The report of the Continental Congress said that the blast sent men, boats, and pieces of the Nancy 30 to 40 yards into the sky. As the smoke cleared, the gory details were made more clear as 11 bodies, 2 laced hats, and a leg fell back into the water. The stunned British, the ones that had survived the assault, immediately started rolling back to the Kingfisher, regroup, to move back to Cape Henlopen with a normal station. Right. When they do that, just before they leave, they fire one last cannonade towards the Americans on the shore. One of those cannonballs strikes Richard Wilkes right in the chest. His brother Lambert arrives on shore just as he dies. So Lambert becomes the only American casualty of the battle. I mean, Richard becomes the only American casualty of the battle. At this point, the British, again, regroup, gather their senses, move back to Cape Henlopen, continue the blockade of the bay. At this point, the supplies that had been rescued from the Nancy are put on board the Wasp, which makes its way around the Cape through the shoals and makes its way up to Philadelphia. Now, there are some additional myths and legends about that. Most of what we know about the battle itself, like I said, comes from John Barry's logs. There's also a report given to the Continental Congress. Now, whether or not the explosion was actually heard in Philadelphia, a bit of a matter for debate, because nobody mentions it in any of the Cape May newspapers or any of the Philadelphia newspapers. You would think an explosion that loud and that dramatic would make the newspaper. The report of the explosion doesn't make the press until a week later in a newspaper in Connecticut. So again, there's a whole telephone game, a lot going on around here. It was definitely a deafeningly loud explosion. Heard in Philadelphia? Maybe, maybe not. But somebody in Connecticut said it was heard. There are also some reports that some of the citizens of Cape May took up arms themselves, took it upon themselves to come help the crew of the Nancy to offload the supplies and put it back onto the Wasp. But again, that's a matter of conjecture. Part of the problem with preserving Cape May County history is that there's not a lot written down. Most Cape May County history, there's a few diaries, there's a few records. Most of it are property tax values, and wills and testaments and that kind of thing. So there's not necessarily a lot of written history about most of the people living in Cape May County at that time. So people may have helped out, but we really don't know. One of those local legends that kind of permeates Cape May County history. But all in all, they saved 256 barrels of gunpowder, 50 muskets, 2 3-pound cannons, swords, and about 1,000 pounds of dry goods. No mention of whether that is the rum or not. These were all items that were desperately needed by the Continental Army, which again, thinking about what had just happened just north of New York. Very soon, the Battle of Long Island is going to happen, and George Washington's army is going to be chased across Long Island, into Manhattan, up Manhattan, into New Jersey. And it's quite possible that some of the supplies that were salvaged from the Nancy made their way to George Washington's army and helped them survive that entire time, making it across Delaware into Pennsylvania. But there can be little doubt about the bravery of the men involved. Now, as for the immediate aftermath, like I said, there was one American casualty, Lieutenant Richard Wilkes. So, after the WASP takes the supplies up, the crew of the Nancy and the surviving ships, they basically take Richard Wilkes' body ashore, and they bring him here. This is Cold Spring Presbyterian Church, which is about an eighth of a mile down the road from Cold Spring Village. This is actually the third building on the site. The original church dates to 1712, making it one of the oldest churches within Cape May County, probably the oldest cemetery in the county. Many of the graves there are the children and grandchildren of the original settlers of Cape May County. So they brought Richard Wilkes here. A brief funeral service was held for him. John Barry gave a eulogy, describing him as one of the bravest men he'd ever seen. Commented on his bravery, and of course Lambert Wilkes had to write letters back home to family explaining what happened. But he is buried on the grounds. In fact, just to the, if you're looking at the church just to the left, there's today a veteran cemetery. And it's named in Richard Wilkes' honor. His original grave was moved when they built the veteran cemetery, but his headstone, so the cemetery is dedicated to him, Morley was it June 29, 1776. And presented by the Daughters of the American Revolution, members here tonight. And that is his headstone. Lieutenant of the Continental Line, Revolutionary War, June 29, 1776, making him the first naval casualty in New Jersey in the American Revolution. Interesting side note about the veteran cemetery, another interesting Cape May fact. Just to the right of Richard Wilkes' grave is a memorial headstone of a young man from Wildwood who was on board the USS Indianapolis. So, Cape May doesn't have a lot of connections, we have a few here and there. Now, as for the rest, people involved, obviously we have the hero, John Barry, who went on to become Commodore and one of the fathers of the American Navy. Now, unfortunately, some of the other people involved didn't necessarily have as heroic a story as John Barry ended up doing. Lambert Wilkes, Richard's brother, goes back to sea, continues to command the reprisal until October 1st, 1777, when it was lost at sea off Newfoundland, with the loss of all hands except for the cook, which is why we don't happen to Lambert. Captain Hugh Montgomery, he went back to sea, he got another ship. He was eventually captured by the British and imprisoned. And as I'm sure many of you know, conditions for American prisoners of war during the Revolution were atrocious. We believe he was held captive on one of the prison barges in New York Harbor. And he was kept there until he was freed in 1780. He did go back to sea, but that traumatic experience of being a prisoner of war obviously played an effect on his mind, what we today call post-traumatic stress disorder. And after going back to sea for a while, he was returning from Providence in the Bahamas when, according to the ship log, his mind became disordered and he leaped overboard in a fit of insanity and was drowned, never seen again. Now, for many years, his daughter Elizabeth petitioned Congress for a pension, basically in recognition of his efforts to basically bring the supplies up to the Nancy and his other efforts out the Revolutionary War. She fought for that for many, many years, and eventually Congress authorized a payment of $5,000 if funds were available in 1858. So we all think Congress moves slow today. It took even longer back then. But like I said, the big hero of the day is obviously surviving here, John Barry, who went on to become one of the fathers of the American Navy. Of course, most of us in New Jersey know him for the bridge. But it is kind of a fitting tribute because John Barry's, one of his major missions was protecting the bay and the entrances up to Philadelphia from the British Navy. So it is a fitting memorial for where he actually did most of his work. Now, that brings us to the last casualty of this story, Turtle Gut Inlet itself. So, it existed for a very long time. This is a chart showing Turtle Gut Inlet in 1904. And in 1925, you can see it's getting very shallow. And that becomes the major problem. It's shallowing out. Here's the very first aerial photograph taken around 1920. And you can see there's very little space for you to actually transit into the back bays there. Now, around the same time, you can see here, there's housing coming here. And like I said, Wildwood, all those barrier islands start becoming populated and built on starting around the 1880s, when everyone starts realizing what a great place the Jersey Shore is to come down on vacation. What ended up happening, they filled it in. 1931, they decided they needed more land for more houses, and so since Turtle Gut Inlet was actually being shallowing out anyway, they filled it in and built houses on it. Here's a picture of it in the 1930s prior to the housing being built, but today it's now part of the town of Wildwood Crest, which is just south of Wildwood itself. So if you're ever driving on Pacific,
I'm sorry.
That's okay, not a problem.
I had to choose between a projector or power. So.
We're all good. I can talk about that. So, basically, if you're driving through Wildwood Crest on Pacific Avenue, when you get to the intersection of Pacific Avenue and Toledo Avenue, that's Turtle Gut Inlet. There's very little there that would ever indicate to anybody that Turtle Gut Inlet ever existed. The back bay is now called Sunset Lake, and there's a little coffee shop deli called Turtle Gut Deli. You can go. That's about the only thing there that indicates that Turtle Gut Inlet was ever a thing. Although there is actually a memorial plaque. I can show you if you want to see that. There's a flagpole right at the intersection of Toledo, right where the bay is. There's a flagpole, a memorial marker, talking about the Battle of Turtle Gut Inlet and dedicating it to the crew of the Nancy on June 29, 1776. There is also within Cape May, you know the layout of Cape May, Lafayette Park within Cape May itself, across from Collier's Liquor Store. Right as you walk into Lafayette Park, where the Cape May Bandstand is, there's a small little plaque on the ground dedicated to Richard Wilkes. That's Cape May's pretty much story in the American Revolution. After that, the colonial militia from Cape May County had a little bit of involvement around the time of the Battle of Brandywine, but the county freeholders at that point in time decided it was more important to keep the militia at home. There was fear that British off the coast would raid the coast, the farms for water and supplies, so the Cape May militia spent the Revolutionary War in Cape May County. Any questions?
Thank you, John.